what is the future then for Australian foreign policy? And I think we're at a foreign policy crossroad. As I've suggested, do we turn right to Washington, where Malcolm Turnbull, has recently noted, we've been mates for a century with the United States. That's his language. He earlier has said that we are joined at the hip with the United States. The idea of being joined to Mr. Trump's hip is something that makes me feel quite nauseous. So that's one option. We can turn to America, we can reinforce the ANZUS alliance, we can commit ourselves much more strongly to the United States, and that is clearly the path that is being presently negotiated by our federal government. Second choice would be turn left to Beijing, our largest export market, and will be a major market for us for many years to come. Remember the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008. Australia sailed through that crisis with quite remarkable ease. Was it because we were very good at our own economics and our own economic policies? No. In fact, our policies probably were problematic. We were awfully lucky that China was going through a huge, massive growth phase in its economy, demanding. Remember the big mining boom in Western Australia and so on? All of that was a consequence of... Yes, was very nice. Yes. So there's our second option. Should we turn left to Beijing? I think there's a third option, and this is one that I take from Malcolm Fraser, who I admire, and who in fact is my second cousin. So I've got a blood obligation there. He called me the communist member of the family. This option would be to proceed straight ahead as an independent, good global citizen, neither turning right to America nor left to Beijing, but saying we are going to stand on our own feet. Now, Malcolm Fraser has pointed out, this would mean exiting ANZUS, telling the Americans ANZUS is ripping up the treaty. Frankly, if you look at the treaty, it's what we call a massively asymmetrical treaty. It says, for example, that in the event of conflict on Australian shores by an enemy, what will America do? Well, first of all, what happens if America is under threat? Well, the obligation in the ANZUS treaty is Australia must immediately go to America's assistance. But if Australia is under immediate threat, there is a procedure spelt out in the ANZUS treaty documents. First of all, it has to be discussed in the Congress. Congress has to decide on a policy. And getting a policy through the American Congress doesn't happen overnight, but attacks do, you see. And then finally, it has to be approved by the American president. That's what we mean by it being an asymmetrical treaty. In fact, it's very much in America's interests, very much. And we shouldn't be surprised by that, because the nature of international politics and great powers in international politics is that they do what they like. If it's in their interests to look after us, they will look after us. But if it's not, they won't. It's as simple as that, and that's the nature, as John Mearsheimer, the arch-American realist policymaker in University of Chicago, the leading American foreign policy analyst, he says that's the tragedy of great power politics. And if you're not a great power, get used to it. That's his point. Well, says Malcolm Fraser, let's get out of ANZUS. Let's become fully independent. Let's tell them to take Pine Gap home. Let's stop the Marines circulating through Darwin, and let's develop our own defence capability. Now, this certainly would mean doubling our defence budget. It'll be a huge drain on our economy. David Martin, back in the 1980s, wrote a book called Armed Neutrality, arguing this very position, saying what we've got to do is to be able to defend ourselves. Let's do that. On the other hand, there are writers like the Professor of International Relations at the Australian National University, Ramesh Thakur, an Indian, a person of Indian origin, but born in New Zealand and educated in New Zealand and Australia. He was, for a while, the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. Very wise and interesting man. And he's saying, do we really need a defence force? It's an interesting question. And he goes on to say, well, why do we need a defence force? Who's threatening us? Who's going to harm us? Are there enemies out there who are breathing fire and brimstone, wanting to come in? And I think there are, as I said, I think it's a contingent of penguins in the Antarctic. They're arming themselves and they're very dangerous. And maybe we do need. But apart from them, who is seriously threatening Australia? Now, of course, it would be naive to say, well, in that case, let's do nothing. We have to do something. And what Professor Thakur is arguing, and so is Professor Joseph Camilleri at La Trobe University, what we should be doing is using our overseas development aid to create real friendships, to work with developing countries, with their problems, and so on, and make ourselves a friend of everybody and enemy of no one. So you've got these two views, if you like. Let's double our defence expenditure, let's be a military power, or let's be a different kind of power. Something like Japan, to some extent, it of course has Clause 9 of its constitution that forbids it from having an offensive military capacity. It's got a defensive military capacity, but it can't go out fighting wars and so on. So we could perhaps, we need to have this conversation, I think, in Australia, to stop our dependent middle power thinking and start thinking, can we stand on our own feet? Can we be autonomous? Can we make a place for ourselves in this strange world? Now, it could mean joining like-minded middle powers as well. As a colleague and I have just published a chapter in a book on middle powers, in which we argue that these can be what we call interlocutors for peace. We could be peace builders by joining with other states.